Wiley, Texas, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors exchanged friendly waves from their porches. It was a peaceful community, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and gossip spread faster than the summer heat. On the surface, the Gore family fit right in. Betty Gore, a 30-year-old middle school teacher, was well respected by students and faculty alike. She was quiet, reserved, and devoted to her family. Her husband, Alan, worked as an electrical engineer, traveling frequently for work, leaving Betty alone with their two daughters. While their marriage appeared stable, those who knew Betty saw the cracks, her loneliness, her growing paranoia about Alan's frequent absences, and her nagging suspicion that something wasn't quite right. And then there was Candy Montgomery. Candy was the opposite of Betty in almost every way. Outgoing, vivacious, and always the center of attention, she had a knack for making friends quickly. She and her husband, Pat Montgomery, had moved to Wiley a few years earlier, settling into the same social circles as the Gores. They met at church, bonded over parenting, and soon Betty and Candy found themselves in a casual friendship. But beneath the friendly smiles and small talk, an undercurrent of tension simmered. Betty had sensed something was off. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that she was overthinking things. But then there were the little signs. Alan had been more distant. He seemed preoccupied, always finding excuses to stay out later. And Candy was always around, always cheerful, always a little too eager to help. Then came the night before it all happened. That evening, Betty sat on the couch, the television flickering in the background, but she wasn't watching. She was staring at the phone, debating whether to call Alan again. He was away on another work trip, and she had a sinking feeling in her stomach that she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the loneliness. This was different. Something was wrong. Across town, Candy was at home, sitting at the kitchen table, deep in thought. She had spent months convincing herself that what she was doing wasn't wrong. She had rules that kept things under control. It was just a little fun, just a way to feel alive again. But now things were getting complicated. Betty was starting to ask questions. Alan was pulling away. Candy sighed, running her fingers along the wooden surface of the table. Tomorrow she would visit Betty's house. Just a quick visit, just to clear the air. And by the time the sun set again, nothing in Wiley would ever be the same. It started with a look. Candy Montgomery had always been a woman who craved excitement, but life in Wiley, Texas, offered little more than predictable routines and polite Sunday conversations. She loved her husband, Pat, in the way a person loves something familiar, like a worn-out chair that's comfortable but uninspiring. The thrill, the passion, the hunger that she had once imagined for herself had long faded. And then there was Alan Gore. Alan wasn't particularly handsome or charismatic. He was an average man with an average job and an average marriage. But that's exactly what made him appealing. He was safe, predictable, a man who, like Candy, was looking for something to break the monotony. The attraction wasn't immediate. It was subtle, creeping in through fleeting glances at church events, shared laughter over inside jokes, and stolen moments when their hands brushed just a second too long. It was in the way Alan's eyes lingered when Candy spoke, as if she was the only person in the room. It was dangerous, but Candy wasn't afraid of danger. One evening after a volleyball game at church, Candy and Alan found themselves alone in the parking lot. The air was thick with tension, unspoken words hanging between them like an invisible thread waiting to be pulled. "I think you're a very attractive woman," Alan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Candy smiled. She had been waiting for this moment. Instead of playing coy, she met his gaze head-on. "Then what are we going to do about it?" Candy had no intention of falling in love. That was never the plan. She laid out the rules from the very beginning, logical, methodical, as if this were a business transaction rather than an act of betrayal. They would meet only during the day, no emotions. This was just for fun. If either of them started developing feelings, they would end it immediately. It was perfect, flawless. And yet affairs are never truly under control. At first it was easy. Candy and Alan met at cheap motels on the outskirts of town where no one would recognize them. They were careful, meticulous in their deception, covering their tracks like seasoned criminals. But Betty knew. She didn't have proof, not yet, but she could feel it in her bones. Alan had been distant, distracted. He had always been a quiet man, but now his silences carried weight, filled with something unspoken. One night she confronted him. "Are you seeing someone else?" Alan hesitated for just a moment. Too long. Betty didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she simply turned away, as if the confirmation of her worst fear had left her hollow inside. She knew who it was, and she wasn't going to let it go. Candy could sense the shift. Betty had become colder, her smiles forced, her presence looming like a shadow that Candy couldn't escape. It wasn't long before Alan ended things. He told Candy it was over, that he needed to focus on his marriage. Candy agreed. She smiled. She acted like she understood. But inside she was furious. Nobody rejected Candy Montgomery. So when Betty called her the next morning and asked her to come over to pick up a swimsuit for their daughters, Candy didn't hesitate. She was going to fix things, one way or another. The small town of Wiley, Texas, was just beginning to stir when the silence of a quiet suburban home was shattered. The day had started like any other, but something dark was lurking beneath the surface, something that had been building for weeks, months, perhaps even years. Inside the Gore household, the air was heavy, thick with tension. The morning light barely seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. A quiet conversation had escalated into something else entirely. Sharp words, accusations, a confrontation that neither person had anticipated, spiraling so quickly out of control. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong was the sharp sound of a struggle. It was not the distant, muffled kind of noise one might hear from a television left on in another room. It was real, raw, filled with movement and panic. Objects clattered, the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Then silence. Then a new sound, a sickening thud. One blow, then another, and another. The rhythm was erratic at first, desperate, fueled by something primal. It was a sound that didn't belong in a home like this, in a town like this. A sound that spoke of rage or fear, or something even darker than that. In the stillness that followed, the aftermath of the struggle became evident. The kitchen, once ordinary, now bore the undeniable signs of violence. The floor was no longer pristine, the counters no longer untouched. The walls, the furniture, everything bore silent witness to what had just occurred. Somewhere in the house, a baby cried. The sound was faint at first, distant, but it was enough to pierce the unnatural quiet. It was a lonely, helpless wail, an echo of innocence trapped within the chaos. It went unanswered. Outside, the neighborhood remained undisturbed. The birds still chirped. The distant hum of morning traffic continued as if nothing had happened. The world had not yet realized that, behind the closed doors of this ordinary home, something irreversible had taken place. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house fell into silence once more. No more sounds of struggle, no more footsteps, just the quiet hum of a world that had not yet caught up to the horror waiting to be discovered. The afternoon heat hung over Wiley, Texas, thick and unrelenting. The quiet neighborhood remained undisturbed, houses lined up in perfect suburban uniformity, each one a mirror of the next. It was the kind of place where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen, but that illusion was about to shatter. Alan Gore had spent the day on a business trip in another town, just as he often did. He wasn't worried when his wife, Betty, didn't answer his first call. Maybe she was taking a nap, or maybe she had stepped out for a bit. But when his calls went unanswered for hours, an unsettling feeling crept into his chest. Betty was a creature of routine. She never ignored him. As the evening stretched on, that feeling twisted into something darker. He dialed again. No answer. He tried their neighbors, hoping someone had seen her. Still nothing. By nightfall, the worry had become unbearable. Alan reached out to Richard Parker, a friend and neighbor, and asked if he could check on Betty. It was a simple request, the kind a concerned husband might make when distance prevented him from seeing for himself. Richard hesitated. It was late, and the idea of walking into another man's house uninvited felt intrusive. But something in Alan's voice made him uneasy. Reluctantly, he agreed. With another neighbor, Lester Gaylor, Richard made his way to the Gore house. The front porch light was on, casting a dim glow across the yard. The door was locked, the house eerily still. They knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. A strange feeling settled between them. Something wasn't right. They circled to the back, testing the doors. Locked. Then Lester tried the garage. It gave way with a quiet creak, leading them into the house. The air inside was stifling, thick, as if it had been holding its breath all day. They stepped cautiously into the kitchen and stopped. The sight before them was something out of a nightmare. The floor was slick, dark stains smeared across the tiles in chaotic patterns. A metallic scent hung in the air, thick, suffocating. There was no mistaking what it was. At first, they didn't see her. Then, their eyes adjusted. Betty lay motionless, barely recognizable. The brutality of the scene turned their stomachs, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. The room around her was frozen in time, as if the house itself had recoiled from the violence it had just witnessed. Neither man spoke. There were no words for this. And then, a sound, a soft, muffled cry. The men turned toward the noise, their hearts pounding. Somewhere in the house, a child was still alive. Bethany, Betty's infant daughter, had been left alone for hours. She had been trapped in her crib, surrounded by silence, oblivious to the horror mere rooms away. Her cries were weak, exhausted. She had been waiting. Richard and Lester moved quickly. One of them lifted the baby into his arms while the other stumbled to the phone, hands shaking as he dialed the police. The nightmare had only just begun. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkened streets of Wiley, Texas, as police cars pulled up in front of the Gore residence. The once quiet suburban neighborhood had been transformed into the center of a crime scene, the hum of radios and hurried footsteps breaking the silence. Officers moved with urgency, their faces set in grim determination. Detective Jim Dwyer was one of the first to step inside. He had seen violence before, domestic disputes gone too far, the occasional bar fight that ended in tragedy. But nothing like this, nothing this brutal. The moment he crossed the threshold into the kitchen, the metallic scent of blood hit him like a wall. It was everywhere. The crime scene was chaotic. Blood had spattered in jagged patterns across the walls, the cabinets, even the ceiling. It wasn't just one or two strikes. It was excessive overkill. Something deeply personal had happened here. And then there was the body. Betty Gore lay on the floor, nearly unrecognizable. The wounds were devastating, dozens of deep lacerations, far beyond what would have been necessary to incapacitate someone. The sheer force behind the attack told a story of rage, of something uncontrolled. The axe lay discarded nearby, its wooden handle sticky with drying blood. Dwyer crouched beside the body, his trained eye scanning the details. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no missing valuables. This wasn't a robbery. Whoever had done this had been inside the house willingly. Had Betty known them? Had she let them in? The infant's presence in the home added another layer to the horror. Bethany had been left alone for hours, helpless, abandoned in her crib. It suggested something chilling. Whoever had killed Betty hadn't taken the baby. They hadn't been interested. That meant one thing. This had never been about a break-in. This was personal. In the adjacent living room, officers took statements from the shaken neighbors. Richard Parker and Lester Gaylor recounted the moment they had found the body, their voices unsteady as they described the overwhelming violence of the scene. Others in the neighborhood had little to offer. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had seen anything suspicious. It was as if the crime had unfolded in complete silence, hidden in plain sight. Dwyer turned back to the kitchen, his mind already constructing possibilities. The brutality suggested overwhelming emotion, rage, fear, desperation. Crimes like this weren't committed by strangers. They were committed by people with a reason, a connection to the victim. And that meant their suspect was already closer than they thought. Detective Jim Dwyer stood in the Gore kitchen, the weight of the crime scene pressing against him. The sheer violence of the attack raised immediate questions. This wasn't a quick, impulsive act. This was personal. Whoever had killed Betty Gore had done so with unrelenting force, delivering over 40 strikes. That wasn't just murder. It was overkill. It was rage. It was hatred. But who could hate Betty Gore this much? The crime scene itself offered few immediate answers. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows. Betty had let her killer inside. That meant one of two things. Either she had trusted them, or she hadn't seen the attack coming until it was too late. Dwyer turned his attention to the murder weapon, an axe heavy and smeared with blood, lying discarded on the floor. The handle was still damp with fresh stains. Whoever had used it had been close, very close, to Betty when they delivered the fatal blows. It wasn't a precision attack. It was frenzied, uncontrolled, like the person wielding it had been lost in the act itself. By the time the forensic team arrived, the crime scene was already telling its story. Blood spatter patterns indicated that Betty had tried to fight back, that she had moved across the kitchen before she had finally collapsed. The kitchen floor was streaked with partial footprints, smudged and chaotic, as if the killer had moved around in panic or confusion before finally leaving. Then there was the strangest part. Nothing had been stolen. Betty's purse sat untouched on the counter. The television remained in its place. Jewelry, money, valuables. None of it had been taken. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more personal. As detectives processed the scene, Alan Gore was still miles away, unaware that his world had just collapsed. He had spent the day trying to convince himself that Betty was fine, that she had just been busy, that there was a logical reason she hadn't answered the phone. But logic couldn't silence the unease gnawing at him. By nightfall, the worry had become unbearable. When he received the call that Betty was dead, the world around him blurred. It wasn't just grief. It was disbelief. How could this have happened? Who would have done this? And then came the question no grieving husband expected to hear. Where were you last night? Alan hesitated, his breath caught in his throat. It was just a procedural question, a standard part of any homicide investigation. But in that moment, he felt it. A shift in the room, the way the officers were watching him. It was the first time he realized he was a suspect, and he wasn't sure how to prove his innocence. The cold, sterile air of the Collin County Sheriff's Office felt suffocating as Alan Gore sat at the metal table, his fingers twitching slightly against its surface. The room was bare, save for the dim fluorescent light overhead that cast harsh shadows on the walls. Across from him, Detective Jim Dwyer observed carefully, his expression unreadable. Years of experience had taught him that grief took many forms, some genuine, some manufactured. Which one Alan Gore was experiencing remained to be seen. Alan looked exhausted. His eyes were swollen, red-rimmed from the weight of loss. Yet there was something else in them, something deeper. Not just sorrow, not just shock. There was hesitation, as if his mind was waging a war with itself, deciding which parts of the truth were safe to reveal. Dwyer had seen that look before, the look of someone withholding something. The timeline had to be established. Alan's last contact with Betty, his whereabouts, his concerns, each detail had to be examined and re-examined. He recounted his attempts to call his wife throughout the day, growing more anxious with each unanswered ring. Betty never ignored his calls. She was meticulous, predictable, and if she missed one, she always called back. But yesterday she hadn't. That alone was enough to set off alarms in his mind. The tension in the room thickened as Alan hesitated over certain questions, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if looking for an escape. Then finally a crack appeared in his composed exterior. He admitted that Betty had been upset the night before. It was a small confession, but an important one. What followed was even more damning. She had accused him of having an affair. Silence stretched between them, heavy and telling. The officers in the room took note of every flicker of emotion across Alan's face. The weight of the admission sat thick in the air, and for a moment he looked like he regretted saying it at all. The nature of the Gore marriage was no longer just a backdrop to the crime. It was now an essential part of the investigation. Betty had been a woman in distress, increasingly suspicious of her husband's behavior. She had sensed something was wrong long before it all unraveled. Neighbors and friends painted different pictures of their relationship. Some said they seemed normal. Others whispered about tension, about the way Betty had been acting differently in the weeks leading up to her death. Then came the revelation that turned the case in an unexpected direction. Alan Gore hadn't just been having an affair. The woman in question was Candy Montgomery, Betty's friend, a fellow churchgoer, someone who was supposed to be trusted. That changed everything. If this was just a crime of passion, Alan was the most logical suspect. A husband caught between two women, wanting a way out. A man with motive. But there was another possibility now, one that couldn't be ignored. What if Candy Montgomery had wanted Betty out of the picture? What if Alan wasn't the one they should be looking at? The interrogation room was cold, the air inside sterile and still. Candy Montgomery sat at the metal table, her hands resting lightly on the surface, fingers barely moving. Across from her, Detective Jim Dwyer studied her carefully, searching for the slightest crack in her composure. Candy had agreed to speak with the police without hesitation, a sign of confidence or arrogance. She hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't protested the questions. If anything, she seemed almost too cooperative, answering every inquiry with a measured calmness that felt unnatural under the circumstances. "Let's go over this again," Dwyer said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was steady, almost casual, but there was an edge beneath it, a test hidden within the words. "You saw Betty Gore the morning of June 13th? Candy nodded. "Yes." "What time was that?" "Around 10 in the morning." "And why were you there?" Candy barely hesitated. "To pick up a swimsuit for Elisa. She and my daughter were having a sleepover, and Betty had forgotten to pack it." Dwyer scribbled something in his notebook, though he already knew this part of the story. Candy had repeated it several times now, each retelling perfectly aligned with the last. But that was the problem. It was too perfect. "Did you notice anything unusual about Betty that morning?" "No." "Was she upset? Agitated?" "No." Dwyer glanced at his notes. "So as far as you knew, everything was fine?" "Yes." There was something chilling about the way she said it, flat, unemotional. Not the voice of a woman grieving a friend. Not even the voice of a woman who was shocked that someone she had seen just hours earlier had been brutally murdered. Dwyer knew better than to call her out on it directly. Instead, he changed course. "How long were you there?" "Not long. 10 minutes, maybe 15. "And then you left?" "Yes." "And you didn't see anyone else around the house? No strange cars, no noises?" "Number, it was just me and Betty." The detective let the silence stretch between them, watching for any sign of discomfort. But Candy held firm, her expression unreadable. Dwyer knew a lie when he heard one. He wasn't sure what she was lying about yet, but something was off. Betty Gore had been butchered in her own kitchen, struck 41 times with an axe. This wasn't the work of a random intruder. This was rage. This was personal. And yet here Candy sat, completely at ease, as if she were talking about an ordinary day. Dwyer decided to push further. "Do you own an axe, Candy?" The question came suddenly, sharp like the blade of the very weapon in question. For the first time, Candy hesitated. It was barely noticeable, a half-second delay, a flicker in her expression before she quickly masked it. "Yes," she admitted. "Everyone does." "It's Texas." Her voice was steady, but Dwyer had caught it. That single, fleeting moment of hesitation. And hesitation always meant there was more to the story. Candy Montgomery left the interrogation room with the same measured steps she had walked in with. She hadn't stumbled, hadn't broken under the weight of Detective Jim Dwyer's probing questions. But that hesitation, the brief flicker of uncertainty when asked about the axe, had not gone unnoticed. It was small, but in investigations like these, small details were what cracked cases wide open. Dwyer didn't believe in coincidences. Betty Gore had been hacked to death with an axe, and Candy Montgomery just happened to own one. Candy Montgomery had also been the last known person to see Betty alive, and Candy Montgomery had every reason to lie. Now the question was simple. Was Candy hiding something because she was guilty? Or was she hiding something because she was afraid? Investigators retraced her movements that day, speaking to those who had interacted with her. Her alibi needed to be airtight, but early inconsistencies began to appear. Candy claimed she had been at Betty's house for only 10 or 15 minutes, long enough to pick up the swimsuit for Elisa, but not long enough for anything significant to happen. Yet one neighbor recalled seeing Candy's car parked outside the Gore residence for nearly an hour. Another mentioned hearing an unusual sound that morning, something rhythmic, something heavy, but had brushed it off, assuming it was just work being done on the house. Then there was the most unsettling detail. Candy had shown up to church later that day, behaving as if nothing had happened. She had smiled, laughed, even chatted with friends, her demeanor light and unbothered. The investigators weren't the only ones disturbed by this. People who had known Candy for years now whispered amongst themselves. The Candy they knew was warm, friendly, always eager to help. But the Candy who sat through that church service after Betty Gore had been slaughtered in her own home, that Candy was a stranger. The forensic team's findings only deepened the growing suspicion. The crime scene had been brutal, but it had also been deliberate. The number of blows suggested something far beyond self-defense, beyond panic. Whoever had swung that axe had done so with unrelenting force, again and again, until there was nothing left of the person Betty had once been. This wasn't about merely stopping an attacker. This was obliteration. Detectives reviewed the medical examiner's preliminary report. The first few wounds had been lethal, meaning Betty had already been incapacitated early in the attack. But the strikes had continued. The killer had kept going, far past the point of necessity. That fact alone shattered any possibility that this had been a moment of fear-driven impulse. This was rage. A crime of this nature wasn't committed by a stranger. It wasn't random, wasn't opportunistic. It had been personal, and personal crimes always pointed back to someone in the victim's orbit. As detectives combed through more statements and evidence, one thing became clear. Candy Montgomery's story wasn't just falling apart. It had never held together in the first place. The Gore murder investigation was reaching a boiling point. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every conflicting timeline was tightening like a noose around the truth. And yet the truth remained just out of reach. There was no confession, no clear-cut motive laid bare, only a collection of inconsistencies and an unsettling sense that something was deeply wrong. Candy Montgomery had walked out of her initial questioning unscathed, composed, confident, her version of events precise and unwavering. But investigators weren't convinced. People who told the truth didn't have to work so hard to remember their stories. They didn't rehearse details. They didn't repeat them word for word. And they certainly didn't maintain eerily perfect control in the face of overwhelming horror. Digging deeper, detectives focused on the time frame of the murder. Betty had been discovered in the early evening, but forensic analysis suggested that she had been dead for hours by then. That meant the window for the crime was narrowing. Whoever had killed her had done so in broad daylight, in a quiet suburban home where someone should have noticed. But no one had. There had been no forced entry, no signs of struggle beyond the horrific final moments. Whoever had entered Betty's home that day had not been an intruder. They had been someone she had trusted, someone she had let inside willingly. As investigators pieced together the timeline, another disturbing revelation surfaced. One neighbor, a retired man who often sat on his porch in the mornings, recalled seeing a car pull into the Gore driveway that day. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was a friend visiting, but now as he was questioned again, he hesitated. Something about the way the car had been parked, angled awkwardly, almost as if the driver had been in a hurry to leave, nagged at him. It was a small detail, but in homicide investigations, small details cracked cases open. There was more. Betty's phone records revealed something chilling. A call had been made from the Gore residence after the estimated time of death. It hadn't been long, just a few seconds, but someone had lifted that receiver. Had the killer called someone? Had they tried to stage something before thinking better of it? Or had there been someone else in the house that day, someone who knew more than they were saying? The detectives needed answers. The forensic team had already begun testing fingerprints found in the kitchen. But there was one particular set of prints that stood out, a partial print smudged near the handle of the axe. It was unclear, not enough to make a definitive match just yet, but it did not belong to Betty Gore. And then came the most unexpected twist of all. While combing through additional witness statements, an officer reviewing interviews from the Gore's close acquaintances found something oddly out of place, a casual remark made by a member of their church group. Candy seemed off that night. That wasn't the strange part. Plenty of people had mentioned how composed she had been, how eerily normal she had acted in the hours after the crime. But this person had noticed something no one else had. A bandage, wrapped tightly around Candy Montgomery's hand. When someone asked what had happened, she had laughed it off, said it was nothing, said she had cut herself on something sharp, innocent enough. But in a case like this, nothing was truly innocent. The investigation into Betty Gore's murder had reached a point where the weight of suspicion was impossible to ignore. The pieces of the puzzle, the narrowed time frame, the lack of forced entry, the smudged fingerprint on the axe, and now the unexplained injury on Candy Montgomery's hand were beginning to form a picture that someone had desperately tried to keep hidden. Detective Jim Dwyer knew that cases like this weren't solved by dramatic confessions or convenient evidence falling into place. They were solved by pressure, by finding the cracks in a story and widening them until the truth spilled out. The process started with revisiting Candy's alibi. She had insisted that she had left Betty's house around 10:15 a.m., yet multiple witness statements contradicted the timeline. The retired neighbor who had seen a car outside the Gore home wasn't sure of the exact time, but he was certain that it had remained there far longer than Candy had claimed. And then there was the call, the one made from inside the Gore house after Betty was already dead. If Candy had left when she said she did, then who had lifted the phone? It was a detail too significant to ignore. Detectives also started pressing harder on Candy's behavior after the murder. The way she had interacted with friends that day, the way she had sat through church events and casual conversations, showing no signs of distress. It wasn't just composure, it was control. A person who had seen something as horrific as Betty's murder should have been shaken. But Candy, she had been eerily normal. Then came the blood evidence. Forensic testing on the crime scene had taken time, but now results were coming in. The blood pattern analysis showed something unusual. Small droplets of blood leading away from the primary crime scene, out of the kitchen, down the hall toward the bathroom. Someone had tried to clean up. Not entirely. There was still an overwhelming amount of blood in the kitchen, suggesting panic rather than premeditation. But there had been an attempt to erase certain traces. The person responsible had been injured during the attack. The blood spatter suggested they had bled. The bandage around Candy's hand, the small but crucial detail that had gone unnoticed in the first round of questioning, now stood out like a flashing red warning light. Investigators knew they needed to confront her again. This time they weren't looking for contradictions in her story. They were looking for her to break. The case had finally come full circle. The investigation that had started with uncertainty and doubt had transformed into something undeniable. Betty Gore had not been killed by a stranger. Her murder had been savage, deliberate, and committed by someone with a personal connection to her. And now all the evidence pointed to Candy Montgomery. Detective Jim Dwyer had seen many suspects try to talk their way out of trouble, but he had also learned that evidence always spoke louder than words. Candy had been careful, calculated in her initial statements, never outright lying, but never giving the full truth either. Yet as investigators pulled apart her alibi piece by piece, the cracks had widened into gaping holes. Now she sat across from him in the interrogation room, her fingers intertwined on the table in a gesture of forced calm. The room was small, windowless, with nothing but the dull hum of the overhead light breaking the silence. She had answered every previous question with confidence, almost as if she believed she could walk away from this. But not this time. Dwyer placed a stack of files in front of her, each one containing a different piece of incontrovertible truth. He started with the timeline, how her story had changed over multiple interrogations, how her estimated time of departure from Betty's house didn't match witness accounts. Next came the testimony of neighbors who had seen her car parked outside the Gore residence for much longer than she had admitted. Then the forensic report, blood found beyond the kitchen, droplets that suggested movement, someone trying to clean up after the attack. And finally, the most damning discovery of all, the axe. The weapon had been examined in detail. The angle of the strikes, the depth of the wounds, the erratic yet methodical destruction of Betty Gore's body, all pointed to a killer who had not just defended themselves, but someone who had lost control. The first few blows had already been fatal, But the attack had continued long after Betty had stopped moving. The medical examiner's report confirmed that at least half of the strikes had been delivered after Betty was already down. This was not panic. This was rage. The silence in the room stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Candy's breathing had changed, though she still held her expression carefully neutral. The evidence had dismantled her carefully constructed story. There was nowhere left to hide. Detective Dwyer leaned forward slightly, watching her reaction. "The facts don't lie," he said finally. Candy didn't respond. She didn't have to. The truth had already spoken for itself. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Candy Montgomery sat motionless, her expression unreadable, while the weight of months of investigation, speculation, and legal battles came to a dramatic close. The trial had captivated not only the small town of Wiley, Texas, but the entire nation. People had debated, analyzed, and argued over every detail. Was this truly self-defense? Or was it cold-blooded murder? Despite the overwhelming brutality of Betty Gore's death, Candy was acquitted of murder, her defense successfully arguing that she had acted in self-defense during a struggle for her life. The decision sent shockwaves through the community, leaving many questioning the nature of justice. But the real verdict, the one that mattered, wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the lives that had been shattered. Betty Gore was gone. A mother, a wife, a friend. Her life had been taken in the most violent way imaginable, and no legal ruling could change that. Her daughters were left to grow up without a mother, forced to navigate a world where her absence was a permanent wound. Alan Gore had lost everything. His marriage had already been crumbling, but what followed was devastation beyond repair. The affair, the betrayal, the murder. It had torn apart the life he once knew. He moved away, remarried, tried to rebuild, but the past never truly let go. And then there was Candy. She walked free, but freedom didn't mean escape. The trial had made her infamous. The whispers followed her. The stares lingered in every grocery store aisle, every church gathering. She left Texas, changed her name, tried to start over. But could anyone truly outrun the past? Could anyone ever wash away the stain of something so brutal? Justice was meant to bring closure, but this case had left behind only unanswered questions. Did the system fail Betty Gore? Did Candy Montgomery truly act in self-defense? Or was there something deeper, something darker that the courtrooms failed to see? Perhaps the real lesson of this case wasn't about the legal verdict at all, but rather about the fragility of the human mind. How jealousy, betrayal, and unchecked emotions could turn even the most ordinary lives into tragedies. The greatest horrors aren't always committed by strangers in the dark. Sometimes they come from the people we trust the most. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the story. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found the content interesting, and feel free to leave a comment below if you have any unanswered questions. And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. See you in the next video.